no one cares about F.E.A.R 2. I mean, it's hard enough to find people who are into F.E.A.R 1 nowadays, what with it being old and built so heavily as a horror game, which will always mean a smaller player base. And that's not even counting the fact that on Steam, you have to get the first game through a bundle that forces you to buy the 2 sequels no fans particularly like at best, and loathe at worst. Which is odd, because once upon a time, F.E.A.R was a huge name. There was no other big Western franchise challenging the Japanese monopoly on action horror. At least until Dead Space, but then the comparisons start to break down because Dead Space is first and foremost meant to spook you. Whereas I like to call games like F.E.A.R horror themed, the focus is on whatever its main genre is, but with a horror aesthetic or setting. BioShock, Bloodborne, Doom, Subnautica, Night in the Woods, Metro, all to a lesser or greater degree are good examples of this. They can be pretty scary, and maybe they will be through their whole run, but it's all more of a supporting genre to the rest of the game. The point being that F.E.A.R was on that spectrum, a spectrum that includes a ton of really popular and well-known titles because they can appeal so much more broadly than a game just designed to scare you. So why did it disappear so suddenly? Why was it this huge phenomenon for a brief second in the early 2000s, and then became irrelevant just as quickly? Anyone who was a fan during that time will give you the same answer. The sequels. And God, is that such a tired answer because you hear it so often as the reason some up-and-coming series died before its time. But it wasn't always like this for early video games. There was a point in time when you actually had more reason to expect a game sequel to be good. And even if it was bad, you wouldn't expect it to kill off the entire franchise for years, or maybe even forever. So a question you might have is, when did it start? When did this start happening, and why? Because you can't just say the lazy, they made good things when I was growing up and now everything new is bad. The problem isn't that there aren't any good new first entries. The problem seems specifically centralized around sequels. F.E.A.R 2 is for sure not the start of this, not even close. But if I'm drawing from my own personal experiences with video games, it's one of the best examples of a sequel hitting critical mass in all of the worst ways. When I think of sequels burying a beloved series, I think of F.E.A.R 2 right away. Immediately, the first problem is that it's just kinda a trash game on its own. No one would even care about this entry if it hadn't had F.E.A.R plastered on the front. It just feels bad to move. I've played slow games, I've played fast ones where you feel like a tank that can barely turn. But F.E.A.R 2 feels less like a cumbersome tank and more like a bicycle with square wheels. I've heard people say certain games feel like your character's underwater, but that doesn't quite convey the grinding awfulness of this one. Because at least if you're underwater, you have a certain freedom of movement. Here you get caught on every single little bit of the environment. It's almost like the movement controls are not just slow, but claustrophobic. It's hard to explain through words, obviously, since it's something you need to feel. But it's so weird considering one of the things F.E.A.R 1 was best known for was its ability to recreate the feel of movie action scenes through fluid movement, not just its particle effects. Effects which have also heavily been toned down, so clearly we're not trying to do The Matrix anymore. Alright, that's fine. Games have switched genre and or focus before, and still carried on as good sequels. This isn't inherently a bad thing, despite the movement being objectively annoying. So what is F.E.A.R 2 going for? Well, visually, what's immediately noticeable is all the glowy stuff. Most F.E.A.R 2 reviews have gone into extensive detail about this, but clearly F.E.A.R 2 wants to be more sci-fi. You could say it's trying to be more like Dead Space, since that came out between F.E.A.R 1 and 2, and seemed to grab up most fans waiting for a F.E.A.R sequel. But if you're gonna compare the visual style of F.E.A.R 2 to any Dead Space game, it'd have to be Dead Space 2, a game that came out 2 years later. The glowy things on every surface is there, they both have lots of mundane office workspaces, and most importantly, they're lit by shades of blue and yellow. And as an aside, this does show that despite how many people trash how F.E.A.R 2 looks, its style can work with more extensive environments and better saturation, which you can actually see in F.E.A.R 2 itself. A lot of this game is very visually boring to me, but there are locations that are also pretty cool, though for some reason they're all at the end, which is weird because they clearly knew what areas best presented the new art style, considering the demo I played back in the day specifically showcased some of the best areas in the game. The conclusion I've come to, and I could be super wrong because I don't understand why they tried to do this, but my best guess is they were trying to be the new Doom. If you're younger, this might be confusing, because we have a great Doom franchise going right now, but between Doom 3 and 2016, there was a huge gap in the franchise after fans got unreasonably mad at Doom 3. So I guess maybe someone was like, this is our time to get into that gap in the market. Because just look at it. This is a Doom 3 lab, this is a Doom 3 rifle, the way you walk feels like Doom 3. This door is one of the most Doom 3 things I have seen in my entire life. Not only are you going to alienate a lot of fans with the change in style and tone, the style and tone they probably really liked considering they're fans, but you're also essentially adding a new genre on top of what was already a precariously balanced genre mashup in the first place. For those who don't know or need a refresher, F.E.A.R 1 was not just a horror FPS heavily influenced by The Matrix. It also had big cyberpunk-style megacorps, was sort of a police procedural at the start, involved a genetically engineered clone army, had a main sort of antagonist who is not only a psychic but also a ghost. I mentioned sort of antagonist because you have to factor in, on top of all of that F.E.A.R is also a very twisty mystery thriller that focused heavily on unpacking family and child abuse. So the amount of plates the devs were already spinning with the first game is nearing ludicrous amounts. We have a game you can barely explain to someone not in the know because it's so many things all at once. And for some reason, someone thought it was a great idea to add flashy near-future sci-fi stuff. As if that would just be easy to blend in seamlessly, like a new natural layer. Maybe it was the devs trying to make all the cyberpunk inspiration more of a focus. Maybe some exec or shareholder got involved and forced some design decisions. Or, I think most likely, the devs at Monolith were kinda rightfully upset that The Matrix Online wasn't doing great, and wanted a chance to prove that they could make some really good cyberpunk fiction, using a known IP that would generate lots of headlines. But ultimately, what this really shows off is the two most glaring failures with F.E.A.R 2 as a sequel. The first being an obvious identity crisis. When you ask people what they want from a sequel, people say something to the effect of, I want the first one, but more. And when corporations hear that, I think they misinterpret what those people mean. Almost always with bad sequels, you'll see them trying to tack new stuff onto an old framework in the hopes that it'll capture that sense of the first one but more. Which seems to almost never work, because everyone forgets that if you add a whole new dimension to a piece of media, it's now becomes something very different. This brings us to the second big problem with sequels that I think F.E.A.R 2 masterfully decides to embrace in the worst ways. And that's refusing to use the built-in premise for sequels that the original entry already set up. The most common version of this is something a lot of fans of long-running TV shows are probably really familiar with, which is ignoring a cliffhanger ending or sequel hook and just going in a purposefully subversive direction. But in F.E.A.R it's a bit more complicated. The biggest part of the F.E.A.R setting that's never really explored is the titular F.E.A.R organization, a governmental agency that was founded to explicitly deal with paranormal threats. The idea that this organization was founded, exists, and has been funded for at least 2 decades implies that they've been spending time dealing with legitimately unexplainable phenomena beyond the Armacam fiasco that we see in the first 2 F.E.A.R games. Considering that the only psychics ever mentioned are Alma Wade and her 2 kids, I think it's also safe to assume that while it's possible they only deal with psychics, it's very unlikely. So, think about that for a second. We have this whole setup about an organization that's already itself a potential premise for an entire series, and we know next to nothing about them. Instead of the sequel dealing with some other completely different paranormal situation that could have come with its own unique mechanics, we just get the same exact antagonist with the same exact genre of gameplay all over again. Maybe if there was something confusing about the plot of the first, or a story arc that needed finishing, then I could see why you would want a direct sequel. But at best, we get a more confusing rehash of information we already had, and at worst, Alma Wade gets made incredibly shallow by having her only new motivation after achieving revenge be to have a kid. 'Cause she's a woman, I guess. I know the whole Harbinger thing made the protag of two connected psychically or whatever, but there's a lot of other places that could lead besides immediately falling in love. Besides, I'm gonna guess they came up with the main premise of the game before writing in this whole twist about Beckett, whatever his first name is, being a successful Harbinger experiment. There must have been a change in the writing staff at Monolith Productions, because there's no way the creators of No One Lives Forever would write a narrative so insulting to one of their characters like this. This is the giant hole I think so many sequels fall into. They're so scared to take the creative leaps necessary to actually give some depth to their settings, even if it's right under their noses. I mean, imagine if instead of the F.E.A.R 2 we got, it had been something maybe like Fatal Frame, where you're off tracking down ghosts with special equipment. Or they could have gone the Men in Black route with aliens. They could have done cryptids, cults. Basically, they could have made the video game version of the X-Files franchise. The point being that what F.E.A.R 2 brought to the table was the next chapter in the Alma Wade trilogy, making her feel less and less like a real well-developed human being with each entry feebly grasping at whatever little bits of her life they had left to fill in as an excuse for a story. So many sequels try so hard to be not too different, but not too much the same either, that they don't spend any of their creativity on deciding what the sequel should even be in the first place. Because long-running series with continuous narratives can be so successful, it seems like we all started subconsciously assuming that every sequel should follow in these footsteps, or at least that it's a safe gamble. What F.E.A.R 2 shows is that this is actually a trap for even the most talented creators, just because it dominates so much of what we think media is when we try to create our own original ideas. And I think it's a trap that's especially easy to fall into for video games, where a viable option for a good sequel is just for its gameplay to be radically improved. But even that nowadays is a bit of a tricky sequel to pull off, if only because the huge differences in quality of controls and mechanics just isn't so extreme in modern times. But all of that is irrelevant to F.E.A.R 2, considering it plays almost exactly the same, except there's a few new vehicle sections, and you can knock things over. I mean, at least in that respect, you can say F.E.A.R 3 tried offering a reason to play it over the first game, even if unfortunately it was caught up in that wave of co-op horror action games. That sequel will have some memories attached to it, good or bad. Unlike F.E.A.R 2, that'll probably just get remembered as the one with the creepy school level, or maybe misremembered as an expansion. Creating a story in the first place is a leap of faith that people will care about what you made. At the end of the day, the only difference between playing it safe initially versus a sequel is that you're throwing away the advantage of already knowing an audience cares about what you make. What a sequel really is an opportunity to pursue riskier ideas. And F.E.A.R 2 shows exactly what it looks like when you throw that opportunity straight into the trash.